documentary has just been released claiming that fresh evidence has been found which reveals what happened to the princes in the Tower, aka Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York. But as an historian, what do I make of the sources presented and the conclusions drawn from them? And has this show really rewritten history? Did the princes in the Tower survive? Keep watching to find out what I think. I'm not going to go through the prince's story in great detail as I already have 2 videos on them which I'll leave linked below for you. However, to understand the documentary's claims, you really need to have at least a basic grounding in English royal history between 1483 and 1499. So I'm going to start today with a quick bit of scene setting for the uninitiated or for those who need a reminder. If you're very familiar with who everyone was and the major events of this period, feel free to skip ahead. In April 1483, Edward IV of England died, leaving his throne to his 12-year-old son by Queen Elizabeth Woodville, Edward V. He was then at Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, in the custody of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, Lord Rivers. However, as they attempted to make it to London, they were met by Edward IV's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who quickly seized control of the boy king and had Rivers and the young monarch's half-brother, Richard Grey, who was also present, arrested. They were taken north and executed soon afterwards. He marched to London, where Queen Elizabeth and her remaining children had fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. He had Edward V's great supporter, Lord Hastings, summarily executed without trial on the 13th of June, pressured Queen Elizabeth into releasing her younger son, the 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York, into his care 3 days later, supposedly to help prepare for the coronation of his older brother, and then, once he had both boys in the Tower of London, he postponed the coronation before declaring all of Edward IV and Elizabeth's children illegitimate, and took the throne for himself as Richard III. His nephews, who later became known as the Princes in the Tower, even though one of them was a king, were never seen outside its walls again. There was an attempt to rescue them in July of 1483, but when this failed, even their mother gave up on them, and began to work with Lady Margaret Beaufort to put her son, Henry Tudor, on the throne, and marry him to Queen Elizabeth's eldest daughter. As for the princes, speculation has raged ever since as to their fate. I would say the most popular theory, then and now, is that Richard III had them killed in order to secure his hold on the throne. But there is another view, which is that they escaped and lived for many years to come. In August 1485, King Richard was deposed and killed at the Battle of Bosworth by Henry Tudor's forces, and the latter became King Henry VII. As per the plan, he married the prince's sister, Princess Elizabeth of York, in January 1486, and every monarch of England, later Britain, since then, has been descended from that couple, and most of the Scottish monarchs too. No remains confirmed to be the princes were ever found, but 2 skeletons discovered under this stairway in the Tower in 1674 were widely believed to be them, and were interred in Westminster Abbey on the orders of Charles II. These bones have never been DNA tested though, so the mystery of what happened to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, persists. The confusion over their fate was only added to during the reign of their brother-in-law, Henry VII, by the emergence of 2 pretenders to the throne. The first was named Lambert Simnel, a boy of about 10 who was presented as the prince's cousin, Edward, Earl of Warwick. Warwick was the son of George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Edward IV and Richard III, and was born in February 1475, making him 12 in 1487. This conspiracy picked up some support, including from another royal cousin, John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, whose mother was a sister of Edward IV, Richard III and Clarence, and also Margaret of York, Duchess of Burgundy, who was another of their sisters. Lambert was ultimately crowned as King Edward VI in Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin in May 1487. Now, something that's going to become important later on is the fact that this conspiracy was rather muddled in its early days. It's evident that in the end, Edward, Earl of Warwick, was settled on as the person to imitate, because he was crowned as Edward VI and documents and coins were issued in that name. But for a while, one of the princes, Richard, Duke of York, born in August 1473, and so 13 years old in May 1487, was apparently the favoured candidate. We can only assume that the conspirators didn't know the real Warwick's fate, or they wouldn't have tried to effect such an easily disproven ruse. In fact, Polydore Virgil, living and writing in England just over 20 years later, says that they heard a rumour he died, and that was why they settled on presenting Lambert as him. In reality, the real Warwick was alive and in the Tower of London. All Henry VII had to do was trot him out and show him off, and that's exactly what happened. Still, the conspirators tried their luck at invading England anyway, a ploy which utterly failed. Henry defeated them at the Battle of Stoke on the 16th of June 1487, Lord Lincoln was killed, and Lambert ended up working in the royal kitchens and later as a falconer. He died in or after 1534. The second pretender was harder to shake off. This is the man known to history as Perkin Warbeck, and between 1491 and 1497 he travelled around Europe claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. He gained some very high-profile support too. Having been in Ireland, he was brought to mainland Europe at the expense of Charles VIII of France in March 1492. When Charles's peace with Henry VII meant that harbouring a pretender to the English throne no longer served him, though, Perkin went to Mechlin, where he was received by the aforementioned Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, who quickly said that she believed the man presenting himself as Richard was indeed her nephew. From there, he went to meet Margaret's stepson-in-law, with whom she was on very good terms, Maximilian, King of the Romans, in Vienna. He also acknowledged him as Richard and supported an invasion of England in July 1494. This failed before it had even really begun, and Perkin fled to Scotland, where King James IV threw his support behind him, even allowing him to marry a distant royal relative, Lady Catherine Gordon, in January 1496. Another invasion of England was attempted that September, and again King Henry prevailed. Warbeck tried once more a year later, in September 1497, when he besieged Exeter, but he and his forces were defeated and he went on the run. He was found at Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire and surrendered when he was promised a pardon. He was then brought to Henry on the 5th of October 1497 and confessed to being an impostor. The king had him paraded through London, but otherwise kept him in honourable confinement. He escaped on the 9th of June 1498, however, only to be recaptured, locked up in the Tower for life, and tortured. There he conspired with the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, to escape in 1499 and seize the throne, but when they were discovered, both were executed, with Warbeck being hanged at Tyburn on the 23rd of November that year. Now that we have the official version of events, let's move on to what the documentary has to say about this period of history. The show is presented by Philippa Langley, best known for her part in the discovery of the remains of Richard III, and Rob Rinder, who is a little bit like the UK's answer to Judge Judy if you're not familiar with him. Langley explains that she has put together a team of volunteers numbering over 300 from all across Europe to look for sources in their local archives relating to the princes, and that is where the evidence which will be examined here has come from. Before we get to that, though, the documentary provides an overview of the history, much as I have just done. It leaves out some pretty salient points, though, cherry-picking evidence to present Richard in what I thought was an unduly lenient light. It claims that he locked up his nephews for their own protection because of the ongoing threat caused by the Wars of the Roses, omitting the fact that the only one going around killing people at this point was Richard himself, who had violently removed Edward V from his maternal family, who were then killed for no valid reason, seized Richard of York from his own mother, and had Lord Hastings murdered. Rinder and Langley also later muse that it is strange that Henry VII looked for the boys after he came to the throne, wondering why he would do this. Well, if it was me, I'd want to be able to show off the remains in order to prevent the kind of problems with pretenders that Henry very soon ran into. I'm not surprised at all that he tried to find out what happened to them. The only thing I find odd, really, is that he didn't just have a couple of skeletons dug up from a little out-of-the-way cemetery somewhere and presented as the remains of his brothers-in-law. Historian Tracy Borman is interviewed and correctly states that there was a widespread belief that the boys were killed by Richard right from the get-go, citing as one source the work of Dominic Mancini. He was an Italian monk who was visiting London in the summer of 1483, he left in July, and who wrote a report on his time there later that year for his employer, the Archbishop of Vienne. He said the following: "After Hastings was removed, all the attendants who had waited on the king, meaning Edward V, were debarred access to him. He and his brother were withdrawn into the inner apartments of the tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, till at length they ceased to appear altogether. The physician John Argentine, the last of his attendants whose services the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him." As well as this quote, remember too that even their mother thought they were dead by the autumn of 1483 and started working towards a Tudor overthrow of Richard III. We then get an interview with art historian Janina Ramirez, who weighs in on what she thinks of Mancini as a source. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to disagree with a lot of her comments though. She says history is written by the winners, and that Henry VII has written the version of the Prince's Tale that he wanted told. But Mancini was writing before Henry came to the throne and was in a different country, so he can't be part of any Tudor propaganda machine. We then get her assessment of him. She says that there is silence around the boys, that there's no mention of murder, that Mancini wasn't there and isn't a reliable source, and that people in a Catholic medieval country wouldn't kill children. That's all untrue though. I've just explained to you that Mancini was there until July 1483, and while it is correct that he stopped short of saying outright that the boys had been murdered and that he didn't speak much English and would have had to rely on translators, that language barrier, which is the only real objection to him, is not enough to discount him in the way that Dr. Ramirez does. Mancini's work is a contemporary source, written by someone who was in England at the relevant time, who had access to the boy's personal physician, who was writing a private report for his employer, who will have expected an honest assessment of the situation, who was not an Englishman and so did not need to be concerned about sucking up to Richard III, and who didn't put pen to paper until he was safe in another country and so didn't need to be concerned about suffering any repercussions as a result of criticising the king. In my view, you do not throw out such a valuable source just because he'll have needed an interpreter sometimes. Dr. Ramirez also expresses dissatisfaction with the fact that he's not an official government source. But to me, not only does this not matter, it can even be viewed as a boon. Richard III was hardly going to confess in any official documentation that he'd murdered his nephews, and more generally speaking, government sources are far from the only type of material which is useful. In fact, a lot of the time they aren't reliable because they're touting whatever line the monarch ordered, and are not intended to be fully private, if at all. She says too that she doesn't trust a lot of what Henry VII put out during his reign. So why are Ricardian sources to be trusted and Henrican ones aren't? I take issue with the double standard here, as well as with the statement that Mancini mentioned nothing of murder. He may not have out and out accused Richard, but he did insinuate strongly that something very bad had been done to those children, saying that "I have seen many men burst into tears and lamentations when mention was made of him," meaning Edward V, after his removal from men's sight, and already there is a suspicion that he had been done away with. Whether, however, he has been done away with, and by what manner of death, so far I have not yet at all discovered. Finally, I completely refute the idea that medieval Catholics wouldn't murder children. Need I remind anyone what Mary I had done to the 16-year-old Lady Jane Grey? Horrendous things happened to minors all the time in the medieval period. Now, I know I've come to very different conclusions regarding Mancini compared to Dr. Ramirez here, but she does appear again at the end of the show to look at the manuscripts gathered up by Langley's team, and I found her assessment of those documents much more satisfactory. I also really enjoy her art history documentaries, so please don't let the fact that we're having a scholarly disagreement here lead you to think that I don't respect her or her work, because in actual fact, I really do. As for Mancini, while he is not perfect, as I've said, I believe he is far better than he is presented here and is as reliable a source as we can hope to get for what was happening in London in the summer of 1483. Far from the suggestion that Richard had harmed his nephews being a later Tudor smear campaign, Mancini shows us that it was being spoken of in the streets within days and weeks of their disappearance into the Tower. Ms Langley also makes some statements which I don't concur with, but I appreciated the fact that the documentary, while not exactly challenging them directly, did provide an alternate way of looking at the story. She stated early on, for instance, that, quote, "there is no evidence anywhere that they were murdered," end quote. To me, this overlooks the fact that they disappeared without a trace, that Richard III offered no explanation for their fate, that bones were found in the Tower which are still suspected to be the children, and that Thomas Moore, writing in the early 16th century, reported that a man named James Tyrrell had admitted in the early 1500s to having organised the crime by having two henchmen smother the boys. Dr. Borman does mention Tyrrell and the bones, however, and she thinks that they are likely those of the princes. Now, don't get me wrong, there are lots of problems with Moore as a source. He wasn't a good historian, his work is littered with errors, and the Tyrrell story can't be authenticated. But my point is just that saying there is no evidence of foul play is untrue. I'd also like to issue a little correction, which is that Moore's work on Richard III is referred to as having been written 50 years later by both Borman and Ramirez, but actually it was published in the reigns of Edward VI and Mary I, but according to his Oxford D&B entry, it was written between 1513 and 1518, or round about there. The real meat of the programme, though, is not a discussion of sources already widely known about, but rather 4 documents discovered by Ms Langley's team of citizen historians. These are all from European archives because she says Henry's reach just didn't get there, so, quote, "Europe is an absolute treasure trove of information." Unless it's coming from Dominic Mancini, I guess. The first of these documents is a receipt from 1487, kept in the archives in Lille. This receipt is for long pikes ordered by King Maximilian, who became an emperor as well, just in case anyone thinks I've forgotten about that fact, and it says that, quote, "these pikes were to be distributed among the German Swiss pikemen who Madame the Dowager sent at that time to serve her nephew, son of King Edward, who was expelled from his dominion." Madame the Dowager is Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, and this 1487 campaign was part of the attempt to put Lambert Simnel on the throne. Now, I see no reason to doubt the authenticity of the receipt. I found the documentary's evidence that it really was written in 1487 perfectly sound, and they showed a close-up of the document where it says "son of King Edward" in French, so I don't doubt their translation either. I find it strange, though, that Miss Langley felt certain it must be referencing Edward V, even though it does not name which of Margaret's nephews it is talking about. In order to support this claim, she states that she has evidence that Edward V was sent from the Tower to the north of England and the Channel Islands, but this is a real blink and you'll miss it moment because she doesn't offer any support for those statements. Perhaps her explanation was edited out, although she has also published a book in tandem with this documentary, which I'll link below for you and add to my Wars of the Roses idea list on my Amazon storefront, so maybe she gives more details there. I haven't read it, so I can't comment on that. I can tell you, though, that she was involved in promoting a theory at the end of 2021 that Richard III sent Edward off to live in Devon, where he stayed under the name John Evans and died and was buried there. However, that theory was thoroughly debunked by David Starkey over on his YouTube channel, so if that's what she's referencing again here, I don't personally give it credence. It also wouldn't fit with the conclusions drawn about Edward's fate at the end of the documentary under discussion here, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. I've left a link to a press article in my description box which discusses the Evans theory if you want to know more. Back to our receipt though. I've come up with 5 explanations for this and who it refers to, some of them more likely than others. The first is that it really means one of the princes in the tower, and that at least one of the boys was still alive and in Europe in 1487. The second is that there was another pretender claiming to be one of them and supported by Maximilian, but about whom we know nothing else. The third is that due to the confusion the Lambert Simnel conspiracy initially experienced when it was still being decided whether to present him as Richard of York or Edward of Warwick, and because letters were slow to move around the continent, the government official who wrote up this receipt still thought that the Longpikes were to support a boy who would be known as Richard of York. The fourth is that the nephew referred to in this receipt is John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln. He fled England in February 1487 and went to Flanders. He was quickly accused of treason back home because of his involvement in the Simnel conspiracy, and we know that when he then travelled to Ireland to be present at the coronation of the fake Edward VI in May, he arrived, and I quote his Oxford DMB entry here, with German and Swiss mercenaries provided by Margaret of York, Dowager Duchess of Burgundy. Now that doesn't get us around the fact that the document refers to the son of King Edward though, and the only explanation I can offer you for that is that it's the medieval equivalent of a typo on the part of the accountant who wrote it. If it was John, he should have been described as the nephew of King Edward, or even the cousin if we take it as a reference to King Edward V. The sixth potential explanation doesn't require any such caveat though, for it is that the receipt is indeed referencing Edward IV's son. But it's not one of the princes in the tower, it's his other son, who I don't believe was mentioned in the documentary unless I missed it. This was Arthur Plantagenet, later Viscount Lisle. Now we know very little about Arthur's life before the 16th century. He was born before 1472 and we don't know for sure who his mother was, but he was Edward's acknowledged son and spent some time at his father's court, possibly growing up in the royal nursery with his half-siblings, as he's mentioned in the nursery accounts. Other than that though, his life is mostly an enigma until 1501, when he pops up again and joins the household of his sister, Queen Elizabeth of York. Perhaps he wasn't always so supportive of her and her Tudor husband though. Perhaps in 1487 he was working with his cousin Lord Lincoln and their Aunt Margaret to overthrow Henry. Who knows? I think he's at least worth a mention though. These explanations aren't perfect, I know, and this is the most intriguing of the documents to me because of that one word, fil, meaning son. But if the real Edward or Richard was in Europe raising an army, I would expect there to be more evidence of that, just as there is other evidence of Lincoln's presence there. As for Arthur, as an illegitimate son, I have an easier time imagining him being able to slip under the radar. The documentary then looks at the Lambert Simnel story. Historian Matt Lewis is interviewed, who says he believes that the boy crowned was actually Edward V, because John, Earl of Lincoln, attended the Dublin coronation ceremony and wouldn't have done so unless it was for his real cousin. He thinks that the whole Lambert Simnel story was a ruse to cover for Edward and keep him safe. I just don't buy this though. Edward V would have been 16 years old in 1487. Who is going to mistake a 16-year-old for a 10-year-old, and what evidence is there that Lambert Simnel was a fake? Who was that boy seized at the Battle of Stoke and put to work in the kitchens, and why did he never admit to having been a fall guy? Philippa Langley and Matt Lewis believe the real Edward V died at Stoke, but there's zero evidence of that. Is it not more plausible that Lincoln went along with this because he thought this was the best way to get Henry VII off the throne, and that perhaps down the line he'd be able to effect a little coup of his own and become King John II? Furthermore, Simnel's supporters presented him as Edward VI, not V, meaning that the only person he could have been impersonating was Edward, Earl of Warwick. If they'd had the real Edward V, they'd have been shouting it from the rooftops, and admitting to his true identity would have been a far better way of attracting support, rather than pretending to be a much younger boy who could be produced back in England. I know that history is written by the winners, a phrase repeated a few times in this documentary when participants don't want to believe the Tudor sources but don't have anything convincing to counteract them with. But just because the winners get to write the history, that doesn't mean they're automatically lying. There is no evidence to suggest that Edward V was crowned in Dublin or died at Stoke, or that the story of Lambert Simnel isn't true. Covering up the fact that Edward had been living on the continent for years, that he was crowned in Ireland, and that a 16-year-old had later been switched out for a 10-year-old would have required the most ridiculous conspiracy, involving hundreds, if not thousands of people over the course of several years. It's simply not feasible. Let's move on to the second document. This comes from a Dutch archive and is supposedly a first-person account of the life of Richard, Duke of York, from the time he entered the Tower of London in 1483 until 1493. It has no provenance, meaning we don't know when or how it came to be in the archive, and is not an original document said to have been written by Richard himself, but rather a copy in Middle Dutch. These are serious problems, and as I watched this, I was getting flashbacks to the video I did on Anne Boleyn's supposed last letter, also a later copy in another hand and highly suspect. Let's press on though. This document claims that Richard of York went into the Tower, was separated from his brother, and spoken to by Lord Howard, who I think was John Howard, soon to be Duke of Norfolk, and who died in 1485 at Bosworth fighting for Richard. Howard dismissed the guards and then handed the boy over to two men called Henry and Thomas Percy. They promised to take him out of England and protect him until certain years had passed. Ms Langley says that she has checked out all of these people and that they were all in Richard's inner circle at the time. The insinuation is that the king had his nephew removed from the country. The Percys supposedly shaved the child's head, changed his clothes, took him to St Catherine's Dock, and from there he travelled to France, then moved around Europe for a few years, including some time spent in Portugal. After Henry Percy died, young Richard supposedly went to Ireland, where he was recognised by the Irish lords. Then he went to the Duchess of Burgundy. In other words, it's saying that Richard, Duke of York, and Perkin Warbeck were the same person, as the tail end of this story is undisputably Warbeck's life during the early 1490s. It's a great yarn, but there are plot holes, and I wish I could read the whole document, as that would maybe help fill some of them in, but I can only go with what I was told in the documentary. On the basis of that, I was left wondering, when was Richard supposedly taken out of the Tower? Because we have the work of Dominic Mancini and the English chronicler Robert Fabian, who wrote the Great Chronicle of London, which together say that both boys were seen there for a period of time, playing on this very spot in the gardens and shooting arrows, and then gradually disappeared from view. Second, why was this done? Why didn't Richard III just keep them locked up, but available for viewing if necessary, so that no one could say he'd killed them? Why go to the trouble of getting them into his power, only to release them into the wind again almost immediately, leaving open the possibility that they would come back with a foreign army to try to retake the throne, and leaving him open to accusations of being a child killer? It makes no sense. Plus, Lord Warwick was kept successfully imprisoned by King Richard and King Henry for virtually his entire life, so it's not as though long-term imprisonment wasn't possible. Third, why did no one working at the Tower ever let slip what had happened? The guards would have known that the last people seen with little Richard were Lord Howard and the Percys, and it would have been virtually impossible to walk or seal the boy out of one of its gates without anyone noticing. Fourth, I'd also like to know why the little Duke of York would be hidden for years. Why not use him to raise an army to dispute Henry Tudor's claim in 1485? Why wait until the 1490s and allow Henry to get his feet under the table, marry the eldest Yorkist princess, and start having children? These mysterious Percy guardians could have taken him to his aunt, Margaret of Burgundy, right away too. Why did he only get to her years later, and how did the Irish lords recognise him as the Duke of York? Finally, who was paying for him to be housed, fed, clothed, transported, and presumably further educated on the continent for all of this time? Richard III died in 1485. Who was footing the bills after that, and why are there no accounts showing these expenses being sent to the continent? The documentary answers none of these questions. All it does is argue that the level of detail in the document signifies its authenticity, but I would disagree. First of all, I don't think it's actually all that detailed, but also the best lies stay as close to the truth as possible, and by including the names of real, but conveniently dead, people and known details of Perkin Warbeck's travels, it does just that. While I don't doubt that it was written in the 1490s, I see nothing in it which indicates that it was copied from a real account written by Richard of York, or that it was dictated by him. I'd also like to point out that Mancini, an undisputed first-hand source for events in England in 1483, writing in a private letter soon after those events took place, is presented as unreliable because he didn't speak English. Meanwhile, this Dutch copy of a supposed lost original, which has no provenance and contains no verifiable facts that aren't already common knowledge, is treated like the Holy Grail and referred to as a wow document. Next, we're shown a room in the ruins of Margaret of Burgundy's palace in Binche, Belgium. This was apparently called Richard's room, and this fact is taken as further evidence that she really did meet and support her nephew, Richard, Duke of York. Again, this seems to me to be a case of seeing what you want to see. I don't dispute that Margaret publicly supported the man now known to history as Perkin Warbeck, and that as part of that support, she may well have named the room he stayed in her home, the Richard Room. It doesn't mean that he was the real Duke of York, or even that the room was named after him. Maybe it was in memory of her dead brother Richard III, or her father, who had the same name. Bear in mind too that Margaret left England to marry Charles, Duke of Burgundy, in 1468, and little Richard of York wasn't born until 1473. She never met him. She also hated Henry VII and refused for many years to recognise his accession. We've already seen, after all, how she supported the Lambert Simnel fraud. From her point of view, Henry had killed her brother, booted her Yorkist family off the throne, and she'd gone from being the sister of the English king, Richard III, to the aunt of the Queen Consort, Elizabeth of York. That's a serious come down, and I have no trouble believing that she would have chosen a Yorkist pretender who was loyal to her over a Tudor on the throne any day of the week, an idea which the documentary also presents in its discussion of her. The alternative, which I also find perfectly plausible, is that she really thought that Perkin Warbeck was her nephew. But again, her believing it doesn't make it true. Document 3. This comes from the Austrian State Archives and is an account of the man I'm calling Perkin Warbeck meeting with Maximilian. It certainly seems to be a genuine and contemporary account of their meeting, written by one of Maximilian's scribes, and it says that Perkin/Richard said he could prove his identity on the basis of 3 marks on his body. 1 on his eye, 1 on his mouth, and 1 on his thigh. Further details of what these marks were is not given. Considering that we have no source that I'm aware of stating that the real Richard had any such distinguishing features, I don't know what this document is meant to prove, nor am I aware that there was anyone at Maximilian's court who had seen the real prince in England back in the 1470s or 80s, and who could corroborate these marks and therefore his identity. If another separate document shows up at some point dating to the 1470s or 80s before Perkin Warbeck hit the scene and which mentions such marks being present on the undisputed Richard, then I think there would be a real case to answer. But there just isn't on the strength of what is presented here. Document 4. This is from the Dresden State Archives. It is dated the 4th of October, 1493, and is a promise from the man calling himself Richard, Duke of York, to Duke Albert of Saxony to give the latter 30,000 florins after Richard has regained the throne, if only Saxony will provide him with support in the here and now to accomplish that goal. It is signed Richard of England and has a beautiful royal seal attached to it with the English arms. Again, as with the other documents, I don't doubt that it dates to the correct time period. The documentary team did do a good job of having things like the handwriting, syntax and watermarks on all the paperwork they showed checked by experts to confirm that they were from the late 15th century. But I see no definitive evidence that this piece of paper was written or signed by the real Richard. We have no documents that I'm aware of that the true Duke of York wrote in order to provide a sample of his handwriting, and even if we did, they would be from a child of 9 or less. I don't know about you, but my handwriting changed considerably between the age of 9 and my adulthood. All I see here is more paperwork generated by the Perkin Warbeck fraud, and it makes perfect sense to me that in trying to drum up support, he would make promises like these to potential allies. Providing a royal seal is all just part of the lie. He's also hardly going to sign such documents with his real name, so of course he writes Richard of England, though Richard of York or even Richard R or Richard IV of England might be what we would expect. Now, Rob Rinder did a generally good job of questioning these documents the whole way through, and most of the questions I was thinking of as the programme proceeded, he then asked. This was no exception. He did query the signature, but all Ms Langley and the archivist could say was that the handwriting looked confident and contemporary. This doesn't help to identify the writer at all, though, I'm afraid. I could confidently write up a letter and sign it Catherine, Princess of Wales, but it doesn't mean I'm actually her. Now, the documentary says it's built on 4 documents, but it does actually mention a 5th, which doesn't get much time, but which says that Richard assembled a fleet at Zealand to invade England in 1495. Once again, this could just as easily be Perkin Warbeck. So those are the documents. The remaining evidence, in inverted commas, which is offered, is actually just the participants' personal interpretations of the actions of Margaret of Burgundy, Maximilian, James IV, and Henry VII. The argument is made that Maximilian, Margaret, and James wouldn't have ploughed so much time, effort, and money into Perkin Warbeck if he hadn't really been Richard of York. The supposed reason Henry VII didn't have him executed right away, and also only, in inverted commas, had him hanged in 1499 instead of hung, drawn and quartered, which was the usual punishment for a traitor, was that he knew he was dealing with his wife's brother, and was also under pressure from foreign courts who viewed or pretended to view Warbeck as the real deal, as Richard of York. You can certainly interpret these rulers' actions in this way if you wish, and I think foreign pressure on Henry not to mistreat Warbeck is a very good point. The man was now married into the Scottish royal family, for instance, if nothing else, but I'd like to offer you some additional explanations to chew on too. Medieval monarchs poured money into wars with other nations or plots to destabilise their enemies all the time. And the French and the English had been duking it out with each other for centuries, as had the English and the Scots. Perkin Warbeck was a fantastic way to undermine the fledgling Tudor dynasty and hopefully get someone on the throne who would be beholden to Maximilian, Margaret, and James. Add to that the fact that Margaret hated Henry for the reasons I've already discussed, and that she, and Maximilian and James for that matter, may have genuinely believed that Perkin was Richard, and I have no problem seeing how they could have supported a pretender whether they realised it or not. As for Henry's treatment of Warbeck, he promised him a pardon if he surrendered at Beaulieu Abbey in 1497, so no, I'm not surprised that he didn't execute him right away. I've already discussed the foreign policy reasons for not killing him, but Warbeck was also useful to parade around in order to show off to the English courtiers the fact that he wasn't Richard of York, and so that he could repeat his confession to their faces if necessary. Finally, Henry had already seen how handy it was to keep prisoners and pretenders like Warwick and Lambert Simnel alive so that they could be wheeled out at opportune moments, and had Warbeck behaved differently after his capture, he might well have been allowed to live a fairly comfortable life. The fact that Henry had him tortured and killed in the end can be read as either the king losing patience with him, despite Warbeck being his brother-in-law, or deciding not to continue treating a would-be pretender with unusual care and consideration when he was just a fraud who had been found plotting against the crown yet again. The historian interviewed at the end of the documentary says she thinks Henry wasn't sure who the man known as Perkin Warbeck was. Personally, I think he did though. Warbeck was shown off at court, Queen Elizabeth must surely have seen him at some point, and I think she would have been able to tell her husband if they were in the presence of her brother or not, especially if Warbeck actually did have any distinguishing marks unique to Richard of York. Bear in mind too, please, that I've never seen or heard of any documents coming out of the Henrican court written by people who saw Warbeck there in the late 1490s and who thought he was Richard. Does Henry's willingness to show him off not suggest that the king was confident that this man was a fraud, and that once his courtiers saw him, especially the older ones who may have seen the real child during Edward IV's reign, they'd know it too? So, final thoughts. Rinder and Langley come to the conclusion that it's, quote, highly plausible that Edward V survived and may have fought and died at Stoke, and that Perkin Warbeck was probably Richard. My own deductions are not as clear-cut. Other than the first document, the 1487 receipt for long pikes to the son of King Edward, the rest look to me like some newly discovered paperwork generated during the Perkin Warbeck fraud. The receipt is very interesting though, and I can completely understand why the team were so excited to find it. On its own though, I don't consider it to be enough to overturn my belief that the boys were likely killed on Richard's orders. I've offered some alternative explanations for it for you to consider, and had Edward survived the tower, I find it bizarre that there is no other paper trail to support that fact, even though he's meant to have lived for years afterwards. I've already also explained why I don't think Richard would have locked up his nephews, only to release them again very quickly, then continue to allow people to think he'd killed them. It would have been better to say nearly anything other than that. He could have claimed they'd been moved to a safe place. He could have said they'd died of the plague. Instead, his silence was deafening. Ultimately, I don't think we're really any further along in the story of the princes than we were in 1674 when those bones were found in the Tower of London, and I wish now more than ever that we could have them DNA tested to give us some solid answers one way or the other. Okay, that's all from me for this week. If there's anything in the documentary which I didn't explore for you, please let me know below. It only aired on Saturday night here in the UK, and I had to have this video done in time to go out to my patrons on Thursday evening, so I've had to put it together at breakneck speed, and there could definitely have been some oversights along the way. If you enjoyed this content, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like more from History Calling, you too can become one of my patrons. Or you can check out that Amazon storefront I mentioned earlier, which includes an idea list of products to do with the Wars of the Roses, such as books about the princes, their family members, and a translation of Dominic Mancini's work. For more on the case of the missing boys, try one of these videos next, and let me know below if you found any of the evidence the documentary presented persuasive and why. Until next time, please do keep learning.